From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Now, I would like to introduce Dr. David Theodore George, the author of Untangling the Mind. In Untangling the Mind, Dr. George has presented us with a virtual owner's manual of the human brain, how it works, how it's put together, and what outcomes you may expect from the inputs we all make to it every day. I think the three major parts of the books explain themselves very well. Part one, why emotions spin out of control. Part two, losing it, extreme behavior. And part three, thankfully, seeking healthy emotion. As Dr. George goes through his presentation, he will probably explain to you how all of these knit together, and he may explain why you see such aberrant behavior as road rage, addiction, and other extreme and unexpected reactions to stimuli. So on behalf of the Library of Congress, I present Dr. Theodore George.
Thank you very much. It's quite a privilege to be here. You have to keep in mind that I'm a psychiatrist and I'm used to dealing with one-on-one. So this is a little bit overwhelming for me, but anyway, what I'd like to do is to share with you just a few thoughts. I guess the first question is, well, why did I write the book? And I've been in practice now for 30 years and seen an awful lot of people. And one of the things that's impressed me is that there's an awful lot of emotional pain that all of us experience at least sometimes in our life. And so anyway, I got together with my writer, Lisa Berger, and so we wanted to sit down, and every time we did, I always said to her, I said, listen, are we going to help people? And so that was sort of my guiding principle as I tried to write this book, was to say, are we going to help people? My idea is sort of, you always look back on these defining moments in your career. And I was doing a research study probably 25 years ago. And you know how it is with your doctors. We were at the end of the session. I was walking out the door, and the gentleman said to me, he says, by the way, doctor, he said, sometimes I'm afraid I'm going to lose control and I'm going to hit my children. And it was one of those questions that I'd not had before, but it really has intrigued me now. As a psychiatrist, we often look at symptoms, we formulate treatments, but the real question that's there is, why do I do these things? Why do I do this? And if you look at the news media just in the last 2 weeks, all of us are asking, well, why did Robin Williams kill himself? He's got everything. We all love him. He's great. Why was he depressed? And so these are some of the questions that we'll raise in the book in terms of as we meet different people to try to understand the emotions and the behaviors that they have. Another defining moment for me was when I was in Kenya. We flew into this area, little plane, dirt landing, and this was taken from the veranda of my hotel room that was built inside of this little mountain, if you will. And the camera wasn't very good, so you can't capture it. But to me, it was one of the most gorgeous places, profound, picturesque things that I'd ever seen. Off in the distance, you would see a herd of elephants, herd of giraffes, gazelles, every animal imaginable that you could see in that little riverbed was hippopotamus. And monkeys were jumping around outside of the room. And I'm saying this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. That evening at around 6 o'clock, the naturalist came and we went out on a van. And when we did, the first thing he said to us was, under no circumstances do you ever get out of this van. It is not safe. And all of a sudden, this serene atmosphere was changed. And it was all about survival, if you will. And here what you see is a cheetah, mama, looking after her 2 cubs. And what you can't see is that she has just taught them how to kill an antelope for them to survive. And she's scanning the environment, looking around. And the naturalist says if she were to leave them, they would be dead. They could not defend themselves. And so basically, this was sort of a defining process for me to begin to look at the nervous system in the context of survival. And here what we have is we have the response to threat and the pursuit of reward. Now, when you think about threat, it's obvious when somebody's got a gun to your head that you feel threatened. But if you look at the nervous system, it's much more profound than that. It may be a look, a tone of voice. Everybody that's married can relate to that. It could be somebody saying, I don't love you anymore. It could be that you've lost your job, or just feeling like somebody's looking down on you and sort of disrespecting you. So in other words, think broadly when you think of threat. The other is the pursuit of reward. We don't have much time today, so I'm not going to get into it. It all makes sense in terms of we pursue food, we pursue air, sexual behaviors. All of this is for survival. And one of the tenets of the book when we look at addictions is that these neural pathways that drive us for things get taken over. And it sort of tries to understand the irrationality that we see with addictions of a person that can be drinking, they've got cirrhosis of the liver, they are going to lose their family, they're going to lose their job. They'll sit in treatment with me and say, doctor, I'm never going to drink again. And they do it. And, how do we begin to understand this sort of irrational side of human behavior? What I'd like to do is just to introduce you to a couple of people that you'll meet in the book. And one of them is Mr. Wilson. And I think he was sort of a favorite of mine to talk about just because I think we can all identify with him. He wasn't quite sure why he came. His wife told him to come. But as you got to know him, he was dealing with the issues that all of us deal with. He was dealing with a child. He was dealing with work. He was dealing with finances. And as far as his child was concerned, both he and his wife loved this girl dearly. And she was having a lot of problems. She got into drugs, she got into alcohol, she was cutting herself, she was depressed. And so he and his wife, they were debating what to do. And Lisa captured it, my co-author, when she said, they kept revisiting the same issues. And I think all of us can identify with that, in terms of sometimes you just get stuck in these loops. But as you got to know Mr. Wilson, there was other features about him that were there as well. And, you could tell that he had an anger problem. And he just sort of said, well, sometimes at work it's hard for me with my boss. He's that kind of a guy, he's a micromanager. He said, I got into it with him, probably shouldn't have, but he deserved it. And it's not too many sessions later, he comes in, he says, well, I lost my job because of cutbacks. So anyway, the work was a problem for him. And then one time he comes in and he recounts his story and he says, I came home and my wife wasn't there. And he said, I was really nervous. Did she leave me? So he calls her on the cell phone and she's out shopping. And so he said, I was furious. Did she not know that we don't have money for this? And she's disrespecting me. He starts to drink, and she comes home. She's furious at him. She hates his drinking. She calls him a loser, and he says, that's it. I'm out of here. Tries to leave, She says, oh, no, you're not. You're not leaving me this time. I'm tired of you walking away from me. Tries to block him, and there's a push that takes place. And so in other words, how can we begin to understand Mr. Wilson? I thought what I would do is just to give you a little reference points when you talk about it in the brain, because it's helpful for me to conceptualize it. Now, I give you a bunch of structures here just because this is taken out of the book and we talk about a number of structures. The ones that I want you to focus on are just the cortex here, because this is going to be sort of the overriding thought process, decision making, puts a lid on emotions, if you will. Another structure is going to be the amygdala. It's in your temporal lobe, and it's so located sort of in this part of the brain. And then one that you probably haven't heard much about is the perioccipital gray. And this is going to be one of the major tenets of the book, is to talk about my PAG. And so anyway, what it is it's in the midbrain, tiny structure that runs along this ventricle canal here. And I then expand upon it here. And so you see this sort of diagram. To me, it's not particularly helpful, but anyway, it's the best that I could do. And you see this columns of neurofibers that are running through this midbrain, and embedded in it are going to be clusters of neurons that have a specific job. And so you're going to see here that there's these active neurons to process the environment, and then there's more passive neurons. Just as an aside, this is highly innervated with a sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, and so now you begin to see the mind-body connection. So what I want to do now is to just sort of give you a model in terms of how I process all of the information here, and then we can build upon it to try to understand Mr. Wilson. And so what you have here is you have sensory input. And most of us, we just sort of take it for granted, but if you think about it, this is critical for survival. Just imagine you're walking through a dark alleyway at midnight, you're all alone, and you hear a noise, or you see a face coming at you. So in other words, this is really important, because it can make the difference of whether you live or die. You also have sensory input from your body that could make the difference of whether you live or die. You have chest pain. Whether you don't deal with it could make a big difference. This sensory input is going to come into your nervous system. It's going to be processed in two major directions. It's going to come up to the cortex, and you're going to have multiple synapses. It's going to take quite a bit of time, but it's going to give you a very precise approximation of what your environment is. But the other thing that it's going to do is it's going to come down here to the amygdala, and it's going to be extremely fast. The amygdala is interesting because what it'll do is it's processing your sensory input outside of your conscious awareness. It's that fast. So it's going to pick up those sights. It's going to pick up those sounds. It's going to pick up those facial expressions that make you feel like you're nothing. And you're going to begin to react to them. Now, the way Ledoux talks about it, who's a sort of a neuroscientist that works with animals, is that you're walking through the woods and you see a wiggly line. You immediately react to it and say, it's a snake. If you look at it longer, you go, no, it's a branch. So in other words, the branch is the cortex, the snake is the amygdala, and that nervous system has to put those two together. That, to me, is really going to be sort of the future of psychiatry, the future of neuroscience, is trying to see how do we process our environment and the sensory input. It's going to be a function of genes, it's going to be a function of our past experience, etc. And then you have output behaviors, and that's taking place in the PAG. You've all heard of fight and flight. Well, that's where I really believe that they have the final pathway that's coming out. So in other words, you've got all this sensory information that's being processed, but now it's got a final common pathway that gets organized in the PAG. So you've got fight here, you've got flight. Another one that's there that you don't hear about is shutdown. And then predatory behavior. Associated with what's going to be emotions. If you ever look at the emotional literature, to me it's a very complicated literature. For me, the way I process it is that emotions are there to drive behavior. It's hard for me to fight if I'm not angry. It's hard for me to flee if I'm not fearful, and etc. So depression is going to drive shutdown. And I can't think of an emotion that's going to drive predatory behavior. What I like about this is that now you have a model where you begin to see that all of these emotions, all of these behaviors, in and of themselves are not wrong. It's the context in which they occur. And so in other words, I can be angry. That could be bad, or it doesn't have to be bad. It could be very appropriate. And so what you have is that this processing thing is on like a rheostat. And theoretically, it should work so that it's commensurate with the stimuli that you're dealing with. And where pathology comes about is when you find yourself sitting on one of these buttons, experiencing the emotion, experiencing the behavior, when it's not connected to the environment and the situation that's driving it. What I want to do is just to spend now a few minutes looking at all of these different behaviors and emotions. Fight, we all talk about it, but what is it? And where I got interested in it was when I was studying domestic violence, and I gave you an illustration of what you saw here with Mr. Wilson. And so in other words, to me, the biology of it, or the animal model, would be the Halloween cat. And if you look at that cat, he gets boxed into a corner, and his tail comes up, first stands up, stands sideways, puffs up its lungs, shows its teeth, hisses at you, and fundamentally that cat is afraid. It's trying to say, stay away from me. And so that basically was Mr. Wilson. And I've done a number of studies in people with this problem. And the thing that was interesting to me is we did PET scans, and it showed that the correlations between glucose metabolism in the cortex and the amygdala were not very well connected in these individuals compared to controls. And so basically, as I see it, the ability to inhibit sensory input isn't there. And so they see something, they hear something, and they overreact, and they can't dampen it down. Another feature about it that was very intriguing to me was when I was studying these individuals, many times they were chronically angry. And my training was, okay, well, let's figure out why you're angry. And you sit there and you talk to them, and finally you realize, I don't think there's a great reason here. You're just angry. And that's really a critical thing when you start to study this and to understand it, because you start to see the importance of those connections between the cortex and the amygdala and driving you out here into these behaviors. Another thing that you noticed about Mr. Wilson was that he was drinking. A large number of these people have an alcohol problem. Think that they feel out of control. Alcohol fills part of that void that's there. The major problem is it drives the behavior just that much faster. So in other words, if you're prone to become violent, you're going to be much more prone to become violent if you're drinking. Road rage, same kind of thing. Another point that's there that's fascinating is that when you're involved in this particular button, when you're sitting on it, your mind sees the world as a threat. You become very focused on whatever the enemy is that you perceive, and you then have the mindset, I am so right, I am so justified. And it makes sense that the body would do this, because if I start thinking, well, what if I'm wrong? They could be right. I'm not going to survive. I am right. That's it. We're going to do it. And so in other words, that's sort of this constellation that you'll see here. Just touch on flight, for example. We saw it with him. Gets threatened. He says, I'm out of here. And so that is that flight type of behavior. I touch on this in the book, and I mean, really, it's not part of the story, but it's so powerful when you think of it. The power of fear in our lives. It's a great thing if there's a tiger outside my door. But so many people are living on this button of fear, and there's no tiger that's out there. And it's very incapacitating. And it's hard to talk about because it doesn't make any sense. It's irrational to me. Why should I be afraid? But I am. And it takes so much energy. It's almost like I'm treading water 3 feet, in 3 feet of water, and you say, I'm getting tired. And I say, stand up, but you don't understand, I can't. And so it just takes so much energy. It's so hard. Shut down. You saw it a lot in Mr. Wilson. He was dealing with the job, he's dealing with his daughter, comes home, just leave me alone. I can't handle any more stimuli. He was depressed. And depression never made any sense to me because it's just an ugly emotion. People feel terrible in depression. And then I read an article back in 2001 or so by Bandler. And what he did was he went in and stimulated the PAG, and the animal became into itself. And he called it going passive. And when I read this, I said, bingo! Finally, I have a model now to begin to understand depression. And so basically, it would make sense that the body would do this. Supposing you've just been out in Oklahoma, you've had the tornado come through, you've lost your house, you've had several family members to die, and going into shutdown is like a shot of Novocaine into your nervous system. It numbs you. It just gives you a little bit of distance. It's not that it takes it all away, but somehow it just removes you enough so that you can begin to deal with it. So it's emotionally, it makes sense. The other thing that it makes sense is I've just been out to battle. I have fought, and I am wounded, and so I have to heal. And if I didn't go into this state, I'd just keep right on going. So in other words, it serves that other physiological role. And you see, now again, we come back to this rheostat, and you can get into this thing and be depressed for no reason. And so that's what I see with so many people when they come in, is that, there is no great reason and that they're just sitting on this button. Predatory, I'm not going to say much about it. It's a fascinating thing. I don't see these people. They don't come into me and say, hey, doc, I'm a real predator. But occasionally I have met them. I've said, what goes on in your mind? And there's a distance that takes place. They're wired differently. They don't have the same fear conditioning that we do. They can't appreciate apathy. Empathy. They can't relate to your pain. And so in other words, you begin to understand it. And here again, it's all on a button. Society loves you if you're sort of got that propensity to be a predator and go get bin Laden. Or if you're president of a company and you're getting out the other company, we love you. But, in terms of, so there's a good side to it, there's a bad side to it. The last one that I thought I would do was to just talk a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder. In order to do this, I thought what I would do is to get a little audience involvement here. There's a person in the book that you're going to meet by the name of Carol. And what I want you to do is I want you to picture that you are Carol. And then just begin to say, how would I feel if I was her? It's a woman that I met a long time ago. She was a young girl at the time when this thing occurred. And she was at a party, had a little bit to drink. She was with 3 other girlfriends, and she was driving home. And as she did, something happened so fast she couldn't even remember. The car flipped. She had her seatbelt on, and she was okay. The other two girls, they got ejected out of the car, were dead. And then the other girl was in the back seat, and she vividly described the screams and the fear that were in that person's eyes as she was trying to get her out of the car. And she ended up dying as well. She says that, she just sort of slinked away from the accident in a numb sort of state, ended up at home. And I want you to sort of picture, get yourselves into her shoes. What would it be like? And basically, I think what you would see is you would see, thoughts coming back into you, scenes coming back at you of that accident, of that girl that had the fear in her eyes. You would be trying to get rid of those thoughts. I don't want to think about it, just put them out of my mind. But you can't put them out of your mind. You would be startled. And then you would have a host of emotions. So basically what PTSD is going to do is it's going to disconnect your cortex from your amygdala, and it's going to give you all of these emotions. It's going to move from anger, why did I do this? What was wrong with me? To just total fear of, what is this going to mean? That's the legitimate part. And then there's a panic that goes on top of it. And then there's that part of just going numb. I can't feel anything. It's just over. Then you add some other symptoms that are there. You're 5 hours later, you're at home. Are you going to feel happiness? Are you going to feel joy? But the one that to me is perhaps the most interesting is, do I see a future? At this particular point in time, my life is over. I don't know how I'm going to go on. So basically what you've done now is you in your mind have concocted the symptoms that you would experience, as I think you would, with PTSD, as I've listened to people that have it. And so in other words, PTSD makes perfect sense if you're in a war. Because if I forget the enemy, if I forget that threat, I could die. And the sense of, you're ready to go, you're angry, to fight, to flight, to flee for survival. And then the other one that you've got is you've got future. If I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about, listen, in 2 months, I'm going home to be with the family, I'm not focused on the war. I've got to focus right now. I can't be thinking about the future. And so in other words, all of these symptoms come together and they make so much sense. The problem is that some people, it stays there. And it just drags on and keeps bothering them. And so in other words, this is a very difficult thing to experience. And something that I'm very passionate about is, we all understand war. But the other things that I see that are driving it, to me, are very troublesome. It's growing up in a home that's not safe. It's domestic violence. It's, some of our streets, they're places, I hear it all the time when I deal with people that have been from the inner city. Sure, somebody died on my street. I saw him get shot the other day. It's just the way it is. And, we just sort of accept this in our society. The other one that's there that's going to cause a large number of cases of PTSD is going to be sexual abuse. And we just don't realize the power of what this does to the nervous system. So in other words, one thing that I forgot to mention about the gal that I think is important is, okay, so she tries to go to sleep that night, and her mind is racing. She can't shut it off. And she learns, well, if I drink some alcohol, I can get some sleep, I can get some distance. The problem is, it just makes it that much worse the next day. It's not the answer to the problem. And then, you start to look at, okay, well, what are some of the ramifications of this PTSD? And, we talk about trying to get people to read, trying to get schools, trying to make our students the best that they can be. But if I'm suffering from PTSD and I have no future, am I going to be that interested in learning? Am I going to be that motivated to say, hey man, I'm going to get out there and start thinking about college and thinking about what I'm going to do? There's no future. My life is over. That sense of being out of control. And so you move from an internal sense of control to an external sense of control. And perhaps then you would join a gang. Or, I wonder about some of these people that I see in terrorist activities. It's an external control that takes care of all this emotions. And then all you have to do is to imagine that person is stuck in anger button. I'm so right. I am so justified. Put a cause on it. And, you begin to understand some of the human behavior that we see. I like to close with one of my favorites. So Barney is the one you'll meet in the last chapter. And this is a gentleman who was 80 years old, and I can still see him standing at the door, and he is so fired up. He's got fire in his eyes. And so I say, Barney, come on in. And so he's got his wife in tow. And I said, Barney, what's the matter? And he says to me, Doctor, I can't stand her anymore. And I said, well, Barney, when did it start? He said, 40 years ago. And my point is that we laugh, but I think, what would their lives have been if, he had the ability to face who he was, to face the situation and say, I'm going to deal with this. And, that's sort of the parting thought that, I want to leave you with is this GPS system. We all have times in our life where we've, quote, missed the exit. And, we have that lady that comes on and says, redirecting your path. And sometimes we hate her, but, she's really our friend. And sometimes, if we make that extra turn, we'll have a different road. It'll be a different experience, but it can still be very meaningful. And that's the hope that I want to leave with you, is that the power of the human mind and spirit to change and to get healthy. And I think we've got tremendous medications, tremendous therapies that are out there that can really help us, and I want to leave you with a sense of hope. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
Over here.
Like up to 28, they talk about anxiety more. Other peers talk about it, even though, when I was a kid, it was just something to deal with and move on. I'm not sure why they focus so much on naming everything.
What was the question?
The question was, so many people up to the age of 28, did you say, label things as anxiety. To me, anxiety is a much more difficult concept to put your finger on. I think we all experience it. I think it's probably a portion of that the cortex and amygdala gets disconnected that makes us more vigilant. And then how do you name something? Somebody names something blue, somebody names it gray. So it's a naming problem that takes place. But I see it as at least a readying system to try to deal with something. And the problem is sometimes, that could be, the test that's coming up tomorrow and it's telling me I better get ready for it. Or it could be that there is no test tomorrow and the anxiety is there. And so it's, again, that sense of button and whether it's appropriate or inappropriate. Because anxiety in itself is not wrong. Yes?
Yes, Dr. George. My question has to deal with, you mentioned a lot in your talk about, almost like you were talking about an electrician, connectivity, disconnection, buttons, how we're wired. And our brain is an chemical electrical organ. Can you talk to how much that wiring, how important that is to how we actually are as a person? And then is there any connection to our DNA and our genes to affect that?
So the question is, we have this wiring, and where does DNA fit into it? You didn't say it, but my guess is responsibility would probably be in there as well, wouldn't you? Okay, good. And this to me is an interesting thing. This system here, what I like about it is it's simplistic because it's about survival. And, then it really does. The only way, to me, life makes any sense is if you're responsible. Otherwise, we just become, life doesn't matter. And so we try to address this issue in one of the chapters there in terms of responsibility. And, you're going to have to know yourself. And it's going to be, listen, I know that I have a problem with anger. And so now what am I going to do about it? And, I seek help. One of the things that I've been excited about is I did a study where I've treated people with domestic violence, and if you take an antidepressant like Prozac, it makes a huge difference in how you're going to do. Two things that it's going to do is I'm not going to be as angry, and I'm going to have an extra second to think before I go off. And this is independent of depression. The next thing is I have to assume responsibility. I know that if I do this and drink, I'm going to probably have a problem. That's something I need to do. And if you look at it, it's the same as any other medical illness. If I have polyps in my colon, then I know I've got to go and get a colonoscopy at least once a year to keep up with it. May not want to, but that's the fact of life, and that's assuming responsibility for my nervous system. Yes?
You talked about how depression was a shutdown of the body, so I was wondering if that could trigger like an actual physical shutdown of the body, like with eating disorders and anorexia, if the depression could then consequently lead to physical shutdown.
Well, the question, you've heard the question here in terms of, that's where I just tried to introduce this concept of the mind-body connection. And for me, I also trained as an internal medicine doctor, and it is so exciting to put those two together. If you look, for example, at fight, okay? Think about what the body is trying to do. It is going to go out there, and it's going to fight the enemy. And when it's on that button, it's anticipating that there could be some injuries that take place. And so, in other words, now you start to see that people that have an anger problem, they have a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease. Now, I may be making a few jumps here, but there's clotting factors that are going to be involved, and there's going to be cytokines that are going to be released. And so, in other words, the body is preparing itself for battle and then to heal. Depression will also have some of those things that are there as well. And it's going to be activating more of your parasympathetic nervous system, so you see how that's going to tie into your gut, and you begin to understand how there can be an interaction between the mind and the body. I think one of the most dramatic cases that I ever had, and I love the case, got referred to me, and it was a woman that had not eaten or drank anything in a year and a half. Every time she went to drink, she would gag, and she couldn't keep it down. So she had a peg that was in place so that they were feeding her directly into her stomach. And so, they'd done all these tests, couldn't come up with anything. And so finally they referred to the psychiatrist. And so I did electroconvulsive therapy on her. And within 3 treatments, this woman was back to eating normally. And so in other words, you see the link between the depression and the gut. And it gave me such pleasure to call the doctor and say to him, when do you think you want to take out the peg? Just joking, sorry. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes. You've spoken about one kind of problem, specifically road rage and things of depression nature. But what about the more severe problems like bipolar, schizophrenia, and the role of medication and how that medication affects the PAG?
I think where I would see it is when you start to look at the imaging studies and stuff that are out there, it would seem to me as though these major illnesses such as, well, I showed it with domestic violence, but you'll see it with panic, you'll see it with depression, is that there tends to be a decreased relationship between cortical structures and these limbic structures. So I think that that's pretty well established. And so now what you see is that, you start to see how these illnesses probably all reflect some sort of lack of inhibitory control that takes you into these strong emotions and behaviors. And medications, you see, make a big difference for depression, for panic, and for anger. So, I think it helps to rehook those things up. And just keep in mind that when that thing totally disconnects, and you'll see it with road rage, you'll see it with domestic violence, you'll see it with somebody in a state of panic, somebody that's in severe depression. You can talk to your blue in the face, and they can't connect with you cortically. That cortex is gone at that particular point in time. Bipolar, I think, is a fascinating illness, and I didn't include it in the book because I really didn't have it built into my model. But if you look at that behavior, it certainly looks as though it would have survival value. I am extremely energized. I have got all the energy in the world, and I can stay up. I'm not going to sleep, and I am invincible. The things that we attack onto it, like you're going out and spending, and it's just a byproduct of severe energy. Schizophrenia, my guess is I would probably put it in terms of the way we deal with sensory input and how you process that. You look at the amygdala and somebody that's my domestic violence guys, they're going to overreact to things. I see my wife talking, she's having an affair. They can't process that same thing. They get jealousy and other things. Thank you. You've been a great audience.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.